Let me explain the title to start with. One is this phrase with which you're probably familiar, not actually coined by Pat Buchanan, but made famous by Pat Buchanan, and that is a culture war. 30 years ago, a sociologist named James Davison Hunter wrote a book called Culture Wars, in which he tried to explain what had occurred in the United States of America in roughly the 30 years between the early 1960s, when it felt like we were still in the 1950s, and his own time. 1991 is when the book was published. And he identified the changes in America as not actually primarily economic in terms of industry moving out of the Northeast and the Midwest, not primarily demographic in the enormous numbers of people that we now had, especially in a city like Houston would have grown enormously over that time, but that the changes in the United States were really about what were called, sometimes dismissively, cultural issues, therefore somehow not hard or not as real as levels of taxation. And they were things like the permission, or then later the legalization, then after that, the approval of marriage by homosexuals. They were things like the permission, tacit, and then the explicit legalization, I think first by Ronald Reagan in California, it could have been in New York, by Nelson Rockefeller, the legalization of abortion, and then Roe v. Wade after that. These things that energized enormous numbers of Christians, especially starting in the 1970s. And along that same time, and Dr. Korchak mentioned some of these folks yesterday, but I think there's a lot more to be said about the growth, not just of classical education, but also of homeschooling, which was relatively unheard of in 1961, but by 1991 was a fairly enormous thing, at least in certain demographics. That these wars were the main things being fought in modern America. They were things about which people voted, but I'm not really talking, nor was James Davison Hunter talking primarily about electoral politics, who gets elected to do what or say what, or because he said what. I'm talking more about realities that we see and reasons that spur growth in new alternatives in education, movement out of public education, movement into new methods of education as with classical. And that is the fear, especially, that your children and your grandchildren will not believe, think, or do any of the things that you do. A legitimate fear, a godly fear, a fourth commandment fear. And that was really the primary dynamic in modern America. This was picked up the next year, 1992, by Pat Buchanan, who got up at the Republican National Convention that year. He would not be nominated. But he got up and said that we were engaged in a culture war and was more or less dismissed for it. But I think if you look at the change just in people familiar to you within your own immediate or extended family, you will not see necessarily or immediately economic changes resulting from deindustrialization. Maybe your children or your grandchildren won't be able to afford to buy a house. But more immediately, you can see massive change over generations in what people think and how they are and what they spend their time doing and caring about. And that change moves in all kinds of directions. Almost nobody was advocating classical Lutheran education as such back when James Davison Hunter wrote that. Very few. In addition to lots of other things that have now grown, for good and for bad. Culture wars. The other term is kind of a sort of a fun one, and it comes from a science fiction novel called The Forever War, which is written around the time of Vietnam by a guy named Joe Haldeman. If you like Starship Troopers, this is Starship Troopers, but more like the movie Platoon or something. It's sort of depressing but great at the same time. That's the Forever War, and it's about setting in outer space this problem of being sent into a war that never ends. It's a term that was picked up in DC circles in the early 2000s to begin to describe why in, say, 2006 we were still in Afghanistan, or why in 2010 we were still in Iraq. So it's a term that kind of moved out of sci-fi and moved into discourse about things that never end. And the problem with things that never end is what they do to the people who are expected to go into combat. In the novel, William Mandela is sent into a war that has lasted at that point for a millennium. He's far away from home, doesn't know why he's there, is excelling in combat, but very, very, very little motivated to continue excelling and wants to go home, but knows that when he does, he will not be understood. When you're asking people to enter into a forever war, you're asking them to continue believing and caring and striving for and about something that has become unclear with time. Even the battles being fought inside the churches or in politics or in culture or media in 1991 are not the ones that we are fighting now. But I do want to suggest that the difficulties that we face are not actually different in kind from what was being faced or described or written about in 1991. And if you want some confirmation of this, either go back to public school in the 1990s and you will find a lot of the same narratives you find now, simply less explicitly. Go back and look at certain media from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, things that were very popular, but promulgated a certain idea about the fundamental evils of America and of its historic population that you will now find simply much more explicitly and constantly in the media and in the news. It is, in fact, a forever war. It's always been there. And not just a war that is framed in explicit cultural or political terms, especially since the 1960s, but it is a forever war to keep Lutheran schools going in a place where we are neither the state church, that would be public education, nor even well understood. And there have been times and places in which Lutheran schooling was under threat of being outlawed. You have to teach in English, or private schooling in Oregon provisionally, but then overturned by the Supreme Court in 1926. Private schooling should be illegal. When I look at the past, I don't see so much a collection of sort of strange objects to be studied. I find instead it's like a stream at which I find various sources and it tumbles down toward me. And as it comes toward me, it grows in power. And there are rocks that it has to cross, and there are barriers to its passage, but it's coming. And as it comes, the thing that I don't want to do is become paralyzed by a sense of exhaustion. I've been doing this for X number of years, and nothing has changed. In fact, the world has gotten worse, and the dangers to the kids that I teach are all the greater. Neither do I want to become filled with anger or disappointment or bitterness, because I recognize that those are all things that will force me into making very poor, especially short-term decisions, which, whether you've read The Forever War by Joe Haldeman or not, you know is very, very bad in combat. In combat, I want training so that when I'm there, I don't have to think too much. And I want the capacity to remain cohesive with my unit and coherent in my own mind and spirit. So today I am saying that you are in a cultural forever war, the end of which I don't see. I don't see a time when this will be totally safe or totally normal, protected, flourishing, and growing without end. But I want to encourage you today to remain steadfast. Now, I said also in the title that the barbarians were new. And by that, I did not mean that all the influences that are pushing them to say and do the things that they do in the government, in the state, in the culture, and in the church, that those things are themselves new. And a lot of them, to be honest, are probably relatively unknown to your opponents. They don't know what Karl Marx said about a variety of things, actually. They haven't read him, and they don't need to. Because your opponents are not organized around ideas or doctrine as you are. Your opponents are generally organized around resentments or anger. That's why they can form violent groups relatively quickly, at least in major cities. And they are organized around destruction. That's why I called them in the title of the talk, Barbarians. Because you are not up against people who are proposing a different form of civilization. Maybe if I were more concerned about China than I am about your fellow Americans, I would have talked about a different kind of civilization. But that's not what we deal with here. And it's also somewhat distinct from 30 years ago, which really wasn't all that long ago. The sense that things could simply just not work anymore, could fall apart. The water just wouldn't turn on in major American cities for indefinite amounts of time. That you wouldn't really be able to travel on a train anything like the speed, even in the Northeast, like they can in Europe or China. That we would be behind in so many measures. Just behind, not able to do it. Can't keep the lights on. What you're dealing with is not something new in its thought, new in its articulation, new in its propagation of the idea that you are categorically evil, but new in its nihilistic destructiveness. They are barbarians in the sense that they want to tear down. They bring nothing beautiful or true or redemptive to human life, either in this life or for the next. So I've used the term barbarian not as a way to describe, as the Romans or the Greeks might, sort of an outside ethnic group. These are our own people. These are Americans too. And the destruction that they wreak is a destruction within families, within governments, within schools, within churches, which is not aimed at uplifting anyone despite their rhetoric. It doesn't build up. It might steal, but it does not add anything of value. It may, in fact, uplift certain groups and their heritage. This is usually conceived in America as a racial thing. It would probably be ethnic if we were in the Balkans. But nothing is fundamentally done for or by those groups that is new. And meanwhile, what is heretofore normal, healthy, good, let's say a heterosexual marriage, is now oppressive categorically by its very existence. At the very time that all these things were taking place and growing, as the stream is increasing in momentum, things like classical education have grown. A sort of desert arose coming up in the desert. Really miraculously, I think, if you look at it. You similarly look at things like the history of homeschooling and other similar movements, the growth of colleges that are uniquely faithful to their confession. All of these things are now coming up. And I use the word miraculous in total earnest because I don't know where it came from. I know the people involved. I know how much work goes into it. But the impetus for it is really rather amazing. That in the midst of so much headwind, so much momentum in the other direction, that something would actually push back, and not just push back, but also grow and even flourish. A great difficulty that I've found very often in churches, especially congregations, is the affliction of nostalgia. Nostalgia for something that unfortunately some people are old enough to remember, which is the most churched time in American history, before the 1950s or since the 1950s. So people can remember before and during our freshest iteration of cultural war, when everything was full, when there were children everywhere. Sort of unfortunately for us, those churches are actually fuller than they were in the 1920s, and the divorce rate was lower in the 1950s than in the 1920s. So nobody really remembers a time slightly more like our own, which was 100 years ago. Some can remember a time very much unlike our own, which was 70 or 60 years ago. And in remembering that, they get trapped in that. And they're prone to tell themselves falsehoods. Many congregations die remembering the time when they were full and doing nothing to make the building full once again. And this is very much the case also with the Lutheran school, let me say, system. Not any one particular school, but the way of filling up the schools with teachers and then administering them as a system. It was only after the Second World War that things like Lutheran high schools came into being in a big way outside a very small number of Midwestern cities. It was only after World War II that it was somewhat normal, once again, to start a school and people would show up and then a congregation would be built on top of the school. All of that is within the living memory of generally the most elderly members of our congregations. And there's something that is wonderful about that because it is inspirational in its own way. The amount of energy and time that was poured into building something. But the times were so different and the influences so absolutely different. Go back and look at The Lone Ranger or Leave It to Beaver. The forms of mass media degrading as everyone receiving the same message from the same screen is, and we now know that, don't we? The forms of mass media were in their own way much more conducive to the life and the proclamation of the church in their own mediocre way. Yes, they were mediocre, but their own mediocre way than what is now commonly taken in by your average 10-year-old. So if we can remember that, it is very tempting to try to get back to that. I think partly because they did not have quite such a similar time, partly because they do not have the denominational weight and inertia that the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has, Reformed folks who are in many ways the pioneers of many of these movements will try to go back even farther and then construct a certain version of especially the 19th century, finding there a sort of non-denominational Christian school, not really teaching Greek or Latin, but good enough, and try to get back to that. I find even nostalgia, even for things they did not experience among my youngest students at the seminary. They could be 24 and they are nostalgic for the 1950s. And there's a sense in which there's nothing bad about it categorically. It can be especially aesthetically inspiring, can stir up things in people, images, music, even film. Change people's sense of what is possible or real or what a gathering of human beings could look like, whether in a school or a church or anywhere. But if we remain in nostalgia, then I believe we will also die in nostalgia. And the Barbarians will find us completely unready. Because no one obsessed by nostalgia, looking at the medals he once received in combat, is actually able to continue in combat. He's instead possessed by something that will overwhelm him and overtake him, living as it were in a kind of a dream, hoping that by some means he can get back to that time travel, the wave of a hand, the snap of fingers. And when he gets back there, then he won't have to worry anymore about all the things flooding in on him. You can hear folks possessed by nostalgia, absolutely possessed by it, because they simultaneously will talk about how great things used to be and speak in incredibly bleak and despairing ways about the future, even if they have grandchildren. Talk about how bad everything is going to be, how bad things are getting. And they'll often use words for our opponents in church and state that appeal to some standard of common sense no one recognizes anymore. Look at these crazy people. Nobody thinks they're crazy anymore. You're not allowed to say that they have a mental illness. And possessed by nostalgia, they're not really ready to build. Because I cannot build anything out of the sheer sense that the past was wonderful and I'd like to get back. The problem being that the human souls under my care, which were always the point, not the school system or the buildings, the individual schools, the individual churches, the point was always the souls. The souls under my care are not under the pressures of 1951 or 1991. They're under the pressures, the temptations, the stresses, and the potential of 2021. They are growing up in a world in which the things that you teach them, the things that you tell them every day, the things that their pastors preach to them, are utterly strange to the people outside the world that they live in. Strange to everyone except maybe, depending on the geographic region, their parents and the people that they see at church. And because that's the case, imbuing them merely with nostalgia will not be good enough. I see classical education in this way as very much parallel to the fight to retain the historic liturgy in the Lutheran Church. It is emphatically not an exercise in nostalgia. If it were, we would be of all men most to be pitied, because we would have placed our hopes not in Christ and what he intends for 2021 or 2031, but we would have placed our hopes in some imaginary thing that we have cooked up or half remembered from 1955, whether we were around then or not. And we would just hope to get back there. The most entertaining version of this is when it's usually a seminarian, and I only pick on them because I love them and they're my crowd, but they will try to tell me that the real mistake that we made was moving from German into English. There's part of that I think is right, but the problem is we just didn't have a choice because we continued existing in America. You know, for better or worse, we kept being here, and so we couldn't hold on to German entirely. But that is to be possessed by nostalgia. And in that case, it's kind of funny. In other cases, it could be destructive. So let me spell this out a little bit more with the parallel between the liturgy and education. That is that in both the liturgy and education, we recognize as evangelical Lutherans that forms are not commanded by God. We recognize that certain ceremonies or lack of ceremonies are not commanded by God. But both the propagation and the extension of the historic evangelical Lutheran liturgy, as also of classical education, are matters of wisdom. They rely on people's capacities to calmly assess what is best, not only or sole, not do this and you'll get into heaven, but best, wisest, most upbuilding, most edifying for the church, most beneficial for souls. And it is remarkable the degree to which these things prevail, especially among all younger Lutherans whom I meet. And I don't think that that is accidental. That when you tell them or you show them the historic liturgy, you tell them or you show them something about classical education, the reason it is immediately appealing is simply because it is unlike everything else. It doesn't need screens. It indoctrinates in actually a far more subtle way than what the media tries to do to you. Much less in your face and obvious and condescending than Netflix is when it wants to get a political point through to you. It is subtle and beautiful and rich, and we didn't think of it in this generation. And it is not, therefore, merely or even mostly nostalgic. It is hopeful and upbuilding, and I speak both of the historic liturgy and of classical education. And the reason that it is hopeful and upbuilding is because it relies upon memory. Memory is the very thing that is being effaced by the barbarians. There's a phrase for that process of effacement, of abolition, we would say now canceling, but it's deeper than that was not actually thought up by the Romans, but was used by scholars in the 17th century to describe what the Romans would do when someone would fall into political disfavor, maybe after his death especially. And then images of him would be taken out of the public place. They would be scratched out, the little tiles in the mosaic chipped away. His statues would be knocked down and crushed. The images of him placed in his family's homes, especially if he's an ancestor, would be taken down and also themselves smashed. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Not of people's capacity to remember, but of anyone's right to be remembered. And there is something, therefore, very much old about the way that the barbarians of our day behave. Taking down, smashing, destroying, putting up nothing in its place. If you go through a city, especially in the American South where this has happened, you don't find anything else on the pedestal. They don't have someone to put up there. So it is replaced with nothing. And no one stops and says calmly, well, there was a consensus in this case about the American Civil War made between the North and the South after the war, that it was in fact a civil war between brothers, and so we came to a certain understanding that we needed to go on living together as Americans, and therefore the Confederates could erect these monuments in memory of their ancestors because it was an honorable cause, even if it was something upon which we disagreed. There is no calm discussion. They are not civilized people. They do not discuss. They do not seek wisdom. They want agreement, or they want to establish that you are an enemy. And when they destroy, therefore, they have nothing to put up in its place. Damnatio memoriae. And we are going through it not in a Roman way, in the sense that one or two people have been found to be out of step with the times, out of step with the current administration. We are going through it in massive groups. This really is not different if you go back and you read public school history textbooks from 1991. It's really not different from what I learned in public school. It's simply much more open and antagonistic. Narratives of white guilt and America's original sin were always there. Now they're just much more explicitly in, as in the 1619 Project, much more explicit theological terms. That's the difference. The theology has become far more open than it used to be. So what to do? Classical education is a recovery of memory. And if you know anything about the Greek myths, you know who memory, Mnemosyne, was. She was the mother of the Muses. The Muses being the sort of graces or goddesses that cover all the useful and beautiful arts. Chief among those, Calliope, who inspires both epic poets and historians, importantly. That Mnemosyne's existence, or in a certain place, if once gone, her return, would mean that a place would have capacities for expression, for beauty, for building, for rebuilding, that they would never otherwise have. And I think one way to explain the difference between classical education and alternatives, private or public, is to talk about how memory is and can be cultivated uniquely. That the pedagogy is all about the filling of memory. Not merely, although I do think this really cannot be neglected, and it's something that was really good about American public education in the 19th century, also with dates and things you just have to know. Something happened in 1066 and it didn't happen in 1067, and you just have to know that. That knowledge of specific dates, times, and people, that James Buchanan comes before Grover Cleveland, if you're trying to tally up your conservative Democrats of American history, is good to know. James Buchanan the only president from Pennsylvania. It's a state of underperformers. I say that as a native, so. And here I am, underperforming, so. You just have to know certain things. And there was a time when American public education required that also of its students. But that is an exercise for memory to build upon. There was a remarkable recovery of memory chronicled a long time ago. I think in the 1940s this book came out by Francis Yates called The Art of Memory, about the Renaissance. And you'll find this both with the 12th century Renaissance as well as with the 15th and 16th century Renaissance, that you get among the people discovering new things, discovering things that have long been hidden away, not read for a long time, not commented upon, not utilized. You will find in them a capacity to remember that is remarkable. Not only to remember a past heretofore hidden to them for any variety of reasons, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, or after the fall of Byzantium, the influx of Greek texts and Greek scholars into the West. But memory is what can utilize those things, do with masses of information. And it is remarkable living in 2021 to go back and read someone from the Middle Ages, the deep Middle Ages, saying, there's too much information. There are too many texts. There's too much to read. That you can have the capacity, memory gives you that capacity to use information. That education is not therefore just the conveyance of a certain amount of information. In our sense, the temptation greatest in our circles, the conveyance of enough Lutheran doctrine so that they stay Lutheran. But it is memory's usage of what is given, memory's uptake of what is given, which is then expressed in the beauty of rhetoric, the beauty of poetry, the beauty of history, the beauty also of music and astronomy and all the other muses, with memory being key to it. And this is so distinctive at this point that it's really hard to express the difference between classical education and other forms better. Because almost any other form of education is now utilizing both technologies that inhibit memory. You just can't remember from the screen what you can from the book or what you heard. You just can't. But also, classical education pushes against the barbaric tendency to expunge the past. I learned almost nothing about the American past until I stopped having to go to a class called American History. Then I learned about George Rogers Clark and the young George Washington before the Revolution, opening up the Trans-Appalachian West. I learned about lots of figures and life that I had never been told about, because all I needed to know was that there were some documents written and people didn't obey them. Then we killed each other. Then the slaves were free. Then we fought the Second World War. Does that sound right to you? You just want to make sure at any one of those times you're on the right side. That was history. I had to go into other things and other texts and find things written years and years and years ago in order to find anything that memory could use or profit from. The way when Plutarch wants to sum up Greek and Roman history and say what is of relatively greater value and what was good about this man and bad about this man and what they had in common that was a vice, he had to dig. He had to write. He had to explain in eloquent and clear terms who someone was. Not trying to set down his own opinion of how things should have gone, or providing some overarching narrative of everything that history has meant, but instead exercising memory through research, through writing, through speaking. This will be enormously, as it is even now for your students, distinctive. So cultivate it. Let them have wonderful memories. They start out with memories far better than anyone's in this room. If you let that gift be utilized, especially when they're young, it will be enormously profitable to them when they are older. And it will give them the capacity to make decisions also within the church, which are decisions of wisdom, not doctrinally cut and dried. Did Divine Service 3 fall down from heaven? Well, it didn't, so we don't have to use it. They'll be able to make decisions of wisdom because they will have memories, resources there for them. And what will this mean for the future? It is why I am, above all things, sanguine, not just about classical education, but about the future of the church in the United States of America, whether or not they remain united. And I am sanguine for at least 3 reasons that have to do with memory's exercise, with its reign among us and its growth among us. One of those, maybe the most superficial, is that it will lead to things being built that are beautiful, things being written that are beautiful, things being composed and painted that are beautiful. My own personal indulgence in nostalgia is to go back and look at expositions which many American cities had in the late 19th and very early 20th century, and to see the buildings that they built, most of which were temporary, and how the people dressed in public when they went out. And it was wonderful. They looked great, and the buildings were great. And the speeches that the politicians gave to average people, if you read something like the Lincoln and Douglas debates followed by farmers in central Illinois, were complex and literate and involved. And Americans had major political issues such as, should we be only on the gold standard, or should we be bimetallic, or do we favor paper money? This was a big issue, especially in 1896. We debated it. Normal people debated these things. This is not for me an exercise in nostalgia. I can't go back to 1896 or to the Centennial Exposition in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia in 1876, although I wish that I could. These things are rather inspiring, because memory can accomplish this. Like Jefferson getting plans all the way over in the woods of Virginia, not even the settled part, to build classical buildings. Figuring out by himself what was meant and how he can make something that looks a lot like what exists in Venice or Naples, and accomplishing it. Planning, constructing, and building anew and beautiful. So by memory, I mean both your students' capacity to have and exercise memory on the individual level, and collectively, the preservation and the building of what is beautiful, what is immediately seen to be beautiful. For the very same reason that most of the pastors in the room have had a call from someone that goes to a not very beautiful church so that they can get married in your church, which actually, quote, over and over again, I've heard this, looks like a church. Beautiful. Memory can do that. Memory can also exercise something that I think is fairly infrequently exercised in modern America, and that is oratory. The end goal for the Roman of his liberal education is so that he can have a public life. And it is not just the American system of government, so obviously patterned according to memory on Greek and Roman predecessors. It is also our church's polity that relies, at least theoretically, on oratory, deliberation, and wisdom. for any cynical joke that could be and probably has been made by some of us, maybe by me, about things like voters' assemblies, district and synod conventions. They rely on public deliberation and oratory, as does also, we used to recognize when we would put things like the classical canons of rhetoric and our homiletics textbooks, so does preaching. Stated by everyone from Walther down to sometime in the 20th century to be the chief office of the Christian pastor, preaching. Relying on arts of oratory, which if you dig into Quintilian, which doesn't take that long, he writes with characteristic Roman conciseness and clarity. The orator relies above all things on memory. He knows what he has to say, and he can say it fluently. So that in opposition to the stream coming down, pouring toward you, terrifying you, what's going to come next? Will everything be swept away? You have a spring welling up from memory. Fresh, delightful, flowing in a different direction. Fluently. And oratory is nourished by memory. Without memory, oratory cannot exist, or it loses much of its power. That's why Romans are trained, some more, some less successfully, to exercise oratory in public life, so that as they pass through the stations of service, which are native to their governing class, they will be able to speak with decision and clarity, and even, at times, beauty, about the things that will benefit the res publica. So we have beauty and oratory, and both of those should be utilized for this purpose, the salvation of souls. Classical education exists for the same reason that our church body was, at least historically, certainly down to the 1950s, fervent in an unusual way among American churches in evangelism. Classical education exists because human souls exist, and certain of them have, by God's grace, been entrusted to us. Those we educate in Lutheran schools, whether congregational schools or home schools. The souls that are not yet in our care, wandering around in the wasteland, having no memory of anything, really, not knowing where they come from, except sometimes to know that it was evil, having no idea of where they're going, having been given no sense of meaning in life except physical and material, merely animal satisfaction. They have no sense of beauty. They have no sense of clarity or purpose. The proclamation of the gospel, both publicly by the ministers of the gospel and privately by every Christian, can utilize memory to proclaim meaning and purpose and clarity and the beauty of Christ to an always increasing number of souls who are completely lost. And I say that as one who was. So what you do is amazing. I'm amazed that it exists. I'm amazed that you're sitting here, all of you. I'm amazed that the schools that you have function as they do, that the things that your children learn are being learned by anyone in 2021. I am amazed that God has done all of this. And it fills me, as I hope it does you, therefore, with hope. Because our hope for the future is both with a memory of a past preserved and handed down from thousands of years ago. Canons of beauty for speech and architecture and painting and music, which have not changed and are still being sung and studied in our churches and in our schools. We have so much richness to draw upon, we will not run dry. Memory's well is deeper than any other. But I am also hopeful because I know what Christ intends for his people. That it is, as the readings and the sermons that we've heard over the past 3 days have said, even if you suffer, it is for your blessing. He surely works all things together for good for them that love him, that are called according to his purpose. You do not teach or learn or pray or sing by your own power or purpose. Your purpose is in him and because of him, and he is the pilot of the entire ship. And I know what he intends for his children, good and blessing. So I know that that will be the case with us. I do not know what will be asked of us in our time, what battles we will fight, what positions we will have to hold, what ridges we will have to take, what fortresses will have to be built, how many more will be built, how many more people will be at this conference in 5 years than today. I do not know any of that, but I am hopeful concerning all of it because I know that he knows and that his purposes are good and gracious. I know too that the barbarians do not prevail. And Augustine said something very similar when the Western Roman Empire was coming to an end. That certain things had been built up around idolatry, giving people a sense of pointlessness, with many social and theological ills inside and outside the church at his time, very similar to our own day. Enormous confusion, even about the most very basic things, shameful things done especially by the emperors and the governing class. The city of man will fall. It does not have memory's resources. It does not have Christ. It cannot prevail, and it won't. What God builds does and shall. There's no other way about it. All flesh will finally prove, no matter how powerful, influential, no matter how many super PACs flesh currently possesses or donates to, no matter how many institutions flesh has taken over in the past 50 years or 100 years of American history, flesh will fade like the grass. It will go away. And some of that will be very painful for us too, but that will be to our good, disciplining us like an athlete. Since the Father loves us, he will discipline us, because we are truly his sons. But the word of the Lord, on which you stake your doctrine, the operation of your schools, the life of your homes, the word of the Lord endures forever. It's not simply a slogan, although it is that too, and that's good. It is a truth. And therefore we will find it at long last, when the forever war is over, to be, as every word of God is, proven true. Thank you.